My mother-in-law asked me to stay outside the most elegant restaurant in town because she believed the way I was dressed would reflect badly on the family. She expected me to wait on the sidewalk until everyone else had been seated, then slip in quietly so no one would pay attention to me. What she did not know was that the reservation she wanted so badly was in my name. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager came outside, greeted me with a respectful bow, and personally escorted me toward the private room my in-laws had spent years trying to book. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I was 52 years old when this happened. Caroline and I had been married for 3 years. During that time, I had made patience into a personal rule. I brought food to family gatherings, even when no one touched it. I smiled through jokes that reduced my work to a hobby. I stayed at the edge of conversations and kept telling myself that familiarity would eventually become acceptance. I believed that if I remained gracious long enough, my wife's family would stop treating me like an awkward addition and begin treating me like one of their own. Instead, the small dismissals accumulated. They appeared in introductions, seating arrangements, clothing suggestions, and the way people asked Caroline questions about me while I was sitting directly beside her. None of those moments looked dramatic by itself. That was part of what made them so easy to excuse. But by a cold Thursday evening in October, the pattern had carried me somewhere I never imagined I would stand. On the bluestone sidewalk outside a restaurant I had helped create while the Whitmore family walked through the doors without me. They had no idea that the private dining room at the end of the corridor existed in its final form because of my work. I had selected the reclaimed oak on its walls, sourced the amber pendant lights, approved the hand-thrown ceramics, and spent weeks adjusting details most guests would never consciously notice. I knew where the light would fall before the first table had ever been set. I had designed the room they were so eager to enter, yet I had stopped explaining that kind of thing to them after the first year, because every explanation seemed to be translated into something smaller. Then the manager came outside specifically to find me. That was the moment 3 years of silence finally reached its limit. 8 months after Caroline and I got married, I had my first real introduction to the Whitmore family dynamic. Not the wedding. The wedding had been careful and polished, and everyone was on their best behavior. I mean, the first ordinary Sunday dinner, the kind of gathering where people stop performing and begin revealing who they are. Caroline and I drove 40 minutes out to her parents' house in Crestwood, a suburb that looks exactly like you'd imagine. Wide driveways, coordinated mailboxes, houses painted in muted shades of gray and taupe, as if someone issued a neighborhood-wide memo. I had dressed up, at least by my own standards, a fitted vintage blazer over a clean blouse, dark slim trousers, and low heels. I'd found the blazer in an estate sale 2 years before. It was good wool and beautifully cut, the kind of garment that had already lived a useful life and still had plenty left to give. Caroline had looked at me before we left and said I looked great. I believed her. Patricia Whitmore opened the door in pressed slacks and a silk shell. Her eyes made one smooth pass from my shoes to my collar. Her expression was not hostile, but it was not warm either. The smile she gave me was the kind that takes a fraction too long to arrive. "Ethan, so glad you could make it." As if I had a choice. The house was a museum of coordinated beige. Every surface looked arranged rather than lived in, curated down to the smallest detail. Family photos lined the hallway in matching frames. Caroline at 15 in a blazer. Caroline's sister Natalie in a string of pearls at what looked like a cotillion. Douglas Whitmore stood in the center of most of them, in the way that men who are used to being the center of things tend to stand. There were 6 of us at dinner. Caroline and me, her parents, her sister Natalie, and Douglas's older sister, Eleanor, who was visiting from out of town. The table was set with the kind of precision that communicates effort and also expectation. Cloth napkins had been folded into decorative shapes, and the centerpiece matched the tablecloth. Candles lit at a height that suggested Patricia had considered their visual impact from seated eye level. I noticed these things because noticing is what I do. It is, in the most literal sense, my job. Halfway through the salad course, Patricia introduced me to Eleanor. "This is Caroline's husband," she said, with a light smile. "He does freelance work." That was all. She did not say that I was a commercial interior designer, that I owned a studio, that I had completed 12 projects in 6 years, or that my most recent restaurant project had been featured by a design publication. She reduced all of it to one vague word: freelance. It was the kind of label people use when they cannot quite categorize what you do, and have already decided the effort is not worthwhile. I smiled anyway, and told Eleanor it was nice to meet her. Caroline did not correct it. Eleanor, who was a perfectly pleasant woman in her 70s with no apparent agenda, asked what kind of freelance work I did. I told her, commercial interiors, mostly restaurants and hospitality spaces. She seemed genuinely interested. She mentioned a restaurant she had visited in the city with wonderfully warm lighting, and I asked which one. She described it. I did not recognize it, but I told her about the principle behind that kind of lighting design. I explained how warm light sources placed at lower angles can create intimacy, and how restaurant designers think as carefully about the light falling on a guest's face as they do about the light falling on the walls. Eleanor said that was fascinating. Douglas, still not looking up from his plate, said, "Caroline tells us you do restaurant interiors. That must be niche." He said it the way someone says interesting when they mean small. The word landed on the table, and no one challenged what he meant by it. After dinner, I helped Patricia carry plates to the kitchen. She set the plates beside the sink, then touched my arm with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades making unwelcome comments sound like favors. "I was just thinking," she said. "There's a lovely shop on Millbrook Avenue. Very classic. It might be worth a visit before the holidays for more polished occasions. She said it kindly and helpfully, with the particular care of a woman who considers herself to be doing you a favor by pointing out what you're missing. I thanked her. I drove home that night, staring at the road while Caroline's hand rested somewhere near mine on the center console. I kept hearing the word freelance. Patricia had said it with the same surface warmth people use when they say, "bless your heart," while meaning something entirely different underneath. To understand why that word bothered me so much, you need to understand who I actually was, because the Whitmores had never bothered to ask. I've been designing commercial interiors since I was 30. I started with small medical offices and a cafe that belonged to a friend, building a portfolio the way most people in my industry do, by doing the work, learning from it, doing better work. By the time I married Caroline, I had 12 completed projects, a small studio in the converted warehouse district of our city, and a steady stream of referrals that meant I hadn't cold called a client in 2 years. I dress the way I design, with intention, without performance. My aesthetic has always been things with history. A scuffed leather chair that outlasted 3 owners, a tile pattern borrowed from a 1940s train station. I shop at estate sales and thrift stores, not because I have to, but because I find things there that you can't buy new. The blazer Patricia looked at that first dinner, the one she steered me toward replacing at the Millbrook Avenue shop, was a 1970s Harris tweed I'd had tailored to fit. It was worth more than anything hanging in the Millbrook shop, but that's not really the point. My mother, Lillian, is the one who taught me that. She raised me in a small house on a careful budget, and she understood early that value is not the same thing as price. She would say, "The Whitmores of the world look at a thrift store blazer and see poverty. You look at one and see possibility. Those are 2 different eyes, baby. You can't fix hers." I thought about that line a lot in the first year of my marriage. 4 years before I met Caroline, I had taken on the biggest project of my career to that point, the full interior design of a restaurant called Moretti's in the upscale district of a neighboring town. The owner, Vincent Moretti, was a referral from a hotel client. Italian-American, old-school gracious, the kind of man who sends handwritten notes on heavy paper. He paid me fairly and on time, which was rarer than it should have been. He credited my work in the restaurant's press materials. On the restaurant's first anniversary, he sent me a case of wine and a card that read, "The room is yours anytime you need it." I laughed when I read it. I didn't think I'd ever need to call in that particular offer. I designed that room in the hardest year of my life. The private dining room at the end of the main corridor was the part of the project I was proudest of. I used reclaimed oak paneling, amber pendant lights from a manufacturer in Vermont, and hand-thrown ceramic place settings from a studio in North Carolina. I wanted the room to feel old, warm, and serious without looking as though it were trying to prove anything. I hadn't been back since installation day. By the first anniversary of our marriage, I'd started keeping count. I was not doing it consciously or angrily, but some part of me had begun tracking the pattern the way a person tracks weather, not to punish anyone, but to understand what kind of climate I was living in. The first clear entry in that private record was Caroline's birthday dinner at the Whitmore house. The table seated 10. Patricia seated me beside Douglas's elderly aunt at the far end. Not cruelly, just systematically, the way you place something on a shelf where it won't get in the way. Near the main cluster of conversation, the Whitmores discussed a local renovation project on a historic building downtown. I had actually consulted on the commercial zoning for that street 2 years earlier. I knew the architect involved, had heard the story of the structural challenges from someone who'd worked the site. When I tried to contribute, Patricia said pleasantly, without breaking eye contact with her other guest, "Oh, Ethan wouldn't know the Ashford family. They're old Crestwood." I had lived in Crestwood for 2 years at that point. The conversation moved on without me. Year 2, Thanksgiving. Patricia's friend Beatrice was visiting, a woman in her early 60s with the particular energy of someone who keeps a social scoreboard and updates it constantly. Beatrice had the kind of money that announced itself through restraint rather than display, and she had spent decades in Patricia's social world. She knew how to read a room in the specific way that Patricia's world requires, not for beauty or meaning, but for hierarchy. Beatrice asked Caroline across the table about her husband. Patricia answered first. "He's creative," she said. The word landed with a soft, definitive thud. Very individual. Then she pivoted seamlessly, the way a river routes around an obstacle, to Caroline's career, her firm, her recent promotion, a deal she'd closed in September that the partners had praised. I sat at the table and listened and counted. 17 sentences about Caroline, 0 about me. I am not someone who counts sentences at dinner tables, or I wasn't. I had become the kind of person who counts things, and I was still deciding how I felt about that. The dress critique was its own escalating story. At an Easter gathering, Patricia pulled me aside before dinner, always the quick word, always with the gentle arm touch that made it feel like concern rather than correction, and said she had noticed I seemed to prefer a more relaxed look, and that for bigger family events, it might be worth stepping it up a bit for the family's sake. She added, "The Whitmores do have a reputation to maintain." She said it the way someone reads a dress code off a laminated card, matter of fact, not unkind. The kindness performed by the implication that she was doing me a favor by telling me. I went home and looked up the shop she recommended on Millbrook Avenue. It sold clothes that all looked like they had been designed for the same man, a man who wanted to take up exactly the right amount of space, and no more. That night, I told Caroline. She said, "She means well. She just grew up differently." That phrase, "she means well," became the sound of a door closing between us, not slamming, quietly swinging shut. That phrase is how you end a conversation, while calling the ending kindness. Douglas's method was different and in some ways more effective. He never confronted, never critiqued. He simply conducted all conversation as though I occupied a slightly different plane of existence. Close enough to be acknowledged, far enough to be irrelevant. He would ask Caroline at the dinner table, "What does your husband think about?" and look at Caroline while waiting for the answer. Not at me, at Caroline. It was as if my opinion might be valid but required translation through someone he considered authorized to convey it. I used to think the behavior was not intentional. By year 2, I had stopped thinking that. By year 2, I had stopped trying to be interesting to them. I had started trying to be invisible, which is a different kind of exhausting. Quieter, more consuming, more personal. You stop offering things. You stop starting sentences. You learn the dimensions of the space you're allowed to occupy, and you stay inside them. What I hadn't stopped, not yet, was trying with Caroline. That mattered, because what was coming would test that too. It is a specific feeling being made to feel small by people who are supposed to be your family. It is not loud. It doesn't announce itself the way cruelty does in movies. There was no raised voice and no clearly villainous line I could point to and call the moment everything changed. It came in through the seams, in a seating arrangement, in a pause before a compliment, in the word freelance used where your profession should be. In 17 sentences about your wife and none about you, in a dress code suggestion delivered with the concerned warmth of someone doing you a favor. And if you absorb enough of it without naming it, if you keep repeating, "She means well, she grew up differently, it's just how they are," the judgment starts to feel like it belongs to you. Like maybe they're seeing something real, like maybe the blazer really was wrong. By the 3rd year of my marriage, I had started declining some Whitmore events. Not dramatically. A work deadline, a headache. I had not announced a boycott, but Caroline noticed, and it created a friction between us that neither of us named. She didn't say her mother was right about me, but she didn't say she was wrong. She existed in the gap between those two things, and the gap was getting wider. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was not complicated. I wanted to be treated like a person at my wife's family table. Not celebrated, not coddled, just included. I wanted to be asked about my work, introduced by name and profession, and seated beside Caroline at her own birthday dinner. I wanted the basic grammar of being acknowledged, the ordinary courtesy extended to guests at dinner tables everywhere except, apparently, this one. I was starting to see myself the way they saw me. It did not happen all the time, but it happened often enough. Before a Whitmore event, I would stand in front of the mirror choosing between what I wanted to wear and what would create the least friction. In those moments, I could feel something settle over me that did not belong to me. A kind of smallness. The posture of someone who had learned to take up less space. My mother, Lillian, called on a Tuesday in September. She lives 2 states away, and we talk twice a week. She knows my voice the way a person knows the acoustics of the house where they grew up, including where it sounds hollow and where it sounds full. She heard it without me saying anything. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself of something," she said. I told her I was fine. She waited. Then I told her about the Easter comment, the seating arrangements, the dress code phone call. She listened without interrupting. "If you've started apologizing for yourself around those people," she said, "that's the line. You don't unlearn yourself for someone else's comfort and call it a good marriage." I should have drawn the line then. I should have had the conversation with Caroline that night, or the next morning. I had the words. I had been composing them for months, but I hadn't. I told myself one more event, one more try, one more chance for something to shift. And so there I was, 6 weeks later, standing outside Moretti's in the October cold, being proven wrong about the value of patience. 6 weeks before the incident, Patricia called Caroline. It was a Tuesday evening, and she came into the kitchen afterward with a particular lightness she gets when her parents have approved of something. Douglas and Patricia were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. They wanted to do a proper dinner, the whole family, a real occasion. They had chosen Moretti's. Caroline was excited in the way children are excited by things their parents had been wanting for a long time. The Whitmores had been trying to book the private dining room at Moretti's for years, she told me. They'd heard it was extraordinary, had tried twice for special occasions, and the timing had never worked. This time they'd gotten a table, though Caroline wasn't sure of the details yet. I stood at the kitchen counter and held very still for a moment. Moretti's. I had designed that restaurant. I had spent 10 weeks of my life in that building, making decisions about joinery and light sources and the weight of a ceramic cup in someone's hand. The private dining room was the project I had been most proud of. Vincent Moretti was a man who had sent me handwritten notes and a case of wine. I said nothing about any of this. The first time I had mentioned my work at Moretti's to Patricia, she had tilted her head with polite incomprehension and said, "Oh, you did a little decorating job there?" I had not brought it up again. I agreed to come. I thought, maybe this is neutral ground, a beautiful room. Maybe this is the night something shifts. 4 days before the dinner, Patricia called me directly, unusual enough that I noticed. She wanted to just mention that Moretti's was a jacket-required kind of restaurant, and that the family would be dressing for the occasion. I heard the subtext clearly. I always did. The subtext was, "You, specifically, are the concern." "Of course," I said. After I hung up, I sat at my drafting table for a long time. "It's a lovely restaurant," she had said. the kind of place where people make an effort. I thought about what to wear for longer than I should have. I owned a deep charcoal blazer I'd worn to a client presentation. Clean-lined, well-fitted, the kind of thing even Patricia Whitmore would have. I laid it on a chair that Monday evening and studied it. Later, Caroline mentioned offhand that her mother had hoped everyone would coordinate in neutrals for the anniversary photos. I hung the charcoal blazer back on a hanger. On Wednesday, Caroline's sister Natalie sent a photo to the family group chat. The photo showed a cream, classically cut dress, along with the message, "Mom says champagne, ivory, or taupe, so chic." The group responded with enthusiasm. No one asked what I was wearing. My name appeared nowhere in the thread. On Thursday, I made a decision. Vintage blazer, a beautifully structured camel tone piece from an estate sale. The wool was soft and heavy, the cut precise. I had paid $40 for it at a house sale in the hills and had it fitted by a tailor. I paired it with dark, slim trousers and simple black heels. I looked clean, composed, and entirely like myself. I was not performing for Patricia Whitmore. Not that night, not anymore. The evening before the dinner, Caroline found my outfit laid out on the chair in our bedroom. She stopped in the doorway for a moment. "That's what you're wearing?" The question was not cruel, but the pause behind it was loud. "Yes," I said. "Okay." After a beat, she added, "My mom's going to notice." "I know." She didn't push further. I didn't offer anything more. We moved around each other in the kitchen and went to bed without saying much. Before I turned off the light, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, this is me. If that is not enough for them, then that is the answer I need. The day of the dinner, I was at my studio by 8:30. I was reviewing material specifications for a new cafe in the Arts District. The owner had good taste and a modest budget, which was exactly the kind of project I liked best. The morning was quiet. I had 3 hours of focused work before I needed to go home and get ready. My phone rang at 11. The caller was Vincent Moretti. We caught up the way we always did, warmly and briefly. He mentioned that the restaurant's 3rd anniversary was approaching, and that he was considering a small refresh of the entry area once the budget was approved. Then he asked, "Are you coming in anytime soon? I've been holding your private room. I haven't allowed anyone to claim it on a permanent basis. You designed it, you should use it." I laughed and said, "Funny enough, I may be there tonight. My wife's family is having an anniversary dinner." "What name is the reservation under?" he asked. "Whitmore, I assume." There was a short pause while I heard him clicking through the reservation system. "I don't see a Whitmore reservation for the private room this evening," he said. Then he paused again. "But I do have a hold under Mercer. I put it in last month after you mentioned that a milestone event was coming up. I thought you might want the room." I stared at my drafting table. Several weeks earlier, during a passing phone conversation, I had mentioned the anniversary dinner. Vincent had offered the room, and I had answered, "Maybe," before moving on and forgetting the exchange entirely. He had not forgotten. "Vincent, you don't have to. It's your room, Ethan. Yes or no?" I thought about Patricia. I thought about the parking lot, the neutral tones, the phone call about making an effort. I thought about the word freelance said with a particular kind of smile. "Yes," I said, "we'll use it." He confirmed that Adrian, the manager, would handle everything. We said goodbye. I sat in my studio for a long moment, looking at the Moretti's folder on my shelf. 4 years old, full of hand-drawn sketches and material swatches, and a signed contract that said Ethan Mercer, principal designer. Then, I packed up my bag, drove home, and got dressed. The reservation was under my name, and no one else knew. That evening, I picked up Caroline and drove to Moretti's, feeling, for the first time in 3 years, like I had something solid under my feet. The Whitmores arrived before us. When Caroline and I pulled into the lot, they were already gathered near the entrance. Douglas, Patricia, Natalie, and her husband Colin, a cousin named Wesley, and Patricia's friend Beatrice, the social scorekeeper. Every one of them wore coordinated neutrals, ivory, cream, and the particular shade of taupe that announces a group planned its appearance together. They had planned it together. The group chat, the photos, the color consultation. A family presenting a unified face to the world, which is something the Whitmores have always done with great intention. I was wearing a camel blazer. Caroline's hand found mine briefly as we walked across the parking lot. I felt her register the gap between my outfit and the family palette. Her grip was the grip of someone bracing. Patricia saw us from 20 feet away. I have been in enough rooms with Patricia Whitmore to know how she processes information. She does not react. She calculates. I watched the calculation happen. A single pass from my shoes to my collar, 0.2 of a second, and then the decision already being executed before I was close enough to speak. She said something quiet to Douglas. Douglas nodded with the small nod of a man who has agreed to something without being asked. Then Patricia stepped forward, away from the group, and took my arm with her usual gentle precision. Her touch was always slightly firmer than warmth required, and slightly more directive than comfort should be. "Ethan, can I have just a quick word?" She walked me 10 feet from the entrance. The family stayed where they were. Beatrice watched. Natalie looked at her phone. Patricia's voice was pleasant and low, the tone of someone explaining a routine procedure. It was not openly unkind, but it was not kind either. "I love that you dressed up, but Moretti's has a certain standard, and I just don't want any of us to feel uncomfortable tonight. Douglas is going to speak with the host. Why don't you wait out here for a few minutes, just until we're all seated? Then you can come in And no one will even notice. The cold air sat between us. I looked at her for a moment. I wanted to be certain I had understood her correctly. You want me to wait outside? I asked. Just for a moment, she replied. It's really not a big deal. I turned and looked at Caroline. She was standing 6 feet away. She had heard it. I knew she had heard it because of the specific quality of stillness that came over her. The stillness of a person who was hoping very hard not to be asked to respond. 7 years of knowing that woman. 7 years. She looked at the ground. Okay, I said quietly, without drama, tears, argument, or any of the things I might have said if I believed they would change anything. I said it because I knew what I knew. And what I knew made saying, okay, the easiest thing in the room. Patricia smiled. The particular smile of someone who has managed a situation, and turned back toward the entrance. The family filed in one by one. I heard the door open. I heard it close. The parking lot was quiet. I stood on the sidewalk outside Moretti's and breathed the October air, just until we're seated. Then you can come in, and no one will notice. I thought, no one will notice, as if that were the thing that mattered. As if the problem was visibility, and not the fact that I was standing on a sidewalk outside a restaurant my wife's family had chosen for the most important dinner of the year, having been told that my presence at the door was an embarrassment to them. 7 minutes, I told myself. 7 minutes, and then everything changes. The sidewalk outside Moretti's was made of irregular cut bluestone, laid in a staggered pattern. 4 years earlier, I had specified stone from a quarry in Pennsylvania. I sourced 3 samples, photographed each one under different lighting conditions at different times of day, and chose this particular stone because of the way it held warmth beneath the amber glow of the entry lanterns at night. The contractor had called it an unusual choice. Most people go with the uniform cut. It's cleaner, I had said. Uniform is clean, irregular is real. I was standing on stone I had chosen because I believed irregular was real. I noticed that. And then I noticed that I was noticing it. Standing on my own work while being asked to wait outside it. And the absurdity and the grief of that sat alongside each other in a way that didn't quite resolve. Through the glass, I could see the lobby. The Whitmores were gathered at the host stand. Douglas was in the middle of an explanation, using the particular physicality of a man accustomed to being listened to. One hand slightly raised, his expression reasonable and confident. The young hostess was checking her screen. She looked politely puzzled. Patricia stood just behind Douglas with her coat still on, one hand adjusting the clasp of her bag. Natalie said something to Colin and he nodded. Beatrice watched the room the way she always watches rooms, cataloging. Caroline had not come back outside. I had looked at the door twice. She had not come back outside. I checked my phone. It was 7:41 in the evening. A text from Vincent had arrived 22 minutes earlier. See you tonight. Adrian will take care of everything. I put my phone back in my pocket. I thought about my mother's voice on the Tuesday phone call. If you've started apologizing for yourself around those people, that's the line. I had heard it, and I had agreed, and I had not drawn the line. I had gone home and laid out a blazer, and decided that this dinner would be different. That quiet dignity was enough. That patience was a form of strength. Standing on a sidewalk in October, I understood the difference between patience and accommodation. Between choosing not to fight and agreeing to disappear. I was not disappearing. I had stopped being angry about 3 minutes in, which surprised me. Anger had burned briefly, and then dropped away, leaving something steadier and more useful. Clarity. The particular clarity of a person who has finally identified the problem and no longer needs to negotiate with it. 7 minutes. I had told myself 7 minutes. I checked my watch. 6.5. The door opened. Not Caroline. Not a hostess doing a wellness check on the man standing alone in the cold. Not anyone I expected. Adrian, the restaurant manager. Dark suit, dark tie, the unhurried bearing of someone who runs a room without appearing to. He stepped through the door and paused on the threshold, scanning the entry path, the planters, the small topiary to the left. Then he saw me. He walked toward me without hesitation. No uncertainty in his bearing, no question about whether he had the right person. He walked toward me like I was the person he had come outside to find, because I was. Adrian stopped in front of me on the bluestone path. He gave a small, formal bow. Not theatrical, not performed for an audience. The kind of gesture that is a genuine expression of professional respect offered to someone who has earned it. Mr. Mercer. His voice was warm and even. Mr. Moretti asked me to personally welcome you. Your party is ready. We've prepared the private dining room as requested. A beat of silence. Thank you, Adrian. I followed him to the door. He held it open for me. Inside the lobby, the Whitmores were gathered at the host stand. Douglas was mid-sentence, explaining a name to the young hostess behind the desk. The hostess was checking her screen with the polite, faintly puzzled expression of someone whose information doesn't match what they're being told. There was no Whitmore reservation for the private dining room. There was a Whitmore reservation. Main floor, a good table, but not the private room. I walked through the lobby. I felt them register it. Not all at once. It happened in sequence, the way things dawn on groups of people. Natalie first, because she was facing the door. Then Beatrice, because she is always watching. Then Douglas, who stopped in the middle of a sentence. Then Patricia, who turned. She watched Adrian lead me toward the corridor, toward the private dining room. It was the room they had been trying to book for 15 years. Douglas began. "What is?" But Adrian addressed him with smooth professionalism without breaking stride. "Mr. Whitmore, your party of 6 is confirmed for the main dining area. Mr. Mercer has reserved the private room for this evening. Mr. Moretti has extended the invitation to include his guests, if he wishes." Silence. Real silence. Beatrice's mouth was slightly open. Natalie looked at Caroline. Caroline had gone very still. I stopped at the entrance to the corridor. I turned around. I looked at Patricia. She was standing perfectly upright, her coat still on, her expression doing the rapid internal recalibration of someone whose plan has just met its opposite. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clear. "You're all welcome to join us in the private room," I said. "Or the main floor is lovely. I hope you'll choose those tables too." I followed Adrian down the hall. The private dining room is at the end of a short corridor lined with photographs of the restaurant's early construction. I had never looked at those photographs before. They had been selected and hung after my work was done, but there they were. The bare concrete floors, the empty structural shell, the raw walls, then the transformation. And there, in one photograph near the end of the row, a man in work clothes and safety glasses, holding a material sample up to a temporary light source, frowning at it with concentration. Me. 4 years ago. I had not known Vincent kept that photograph. The private dining room was exactly as I had left it. That's not quite right. It had been used, loved, lived in. There were small signs of 4 years of careful service. The oak had deepened in tone. The ceramics bore the faint glaze of much handling. But the bones were mine. The amber pendants threw the same precise pools of warmth I had intended. The joinery met at the corners the way I'd specified. The room felt old and serious and honest. I stood in the entrance for a moment before I sat down. Vincent came in from the kitchen corridor, not hurrying, just present. He was not supposed to be there that evening. He had a restaurant to run, but he had heard I was coming, and he had stayed. He crossed the room and greeted me with a brief, genuine embrace. "Ethan, I finally get to actually feed you in here." Behind me, I heard the family entering cautiously, in the particular order of people who are not sure how to enter a room they didn't expect to be in. Douglas first, then Patricia, then Natalie and Colin, then Caroline. Wesley lingered. Beatrice followed them. Vincent glanced at the gathering group with the unhurried warmth of a man in his own restaurant. "You're in very good hands tonight," he said to the room, naturally, without drama. This space was designed by the most talented designer I've ever worked with. "Everything you see," he imagined. He gestured toward me. He did not linger to watch the effect. He was not making a point. He had a restaurant to run. He squeezed my shoulder once and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Patricia sat down. She was looking at the oak paneling, the joinery, the light fixtures, the specific texture of the wall behind the buffet credenza. I watched her doing the math. I watched the math not working in her favor. Douglas cleared his throat and took his seat. Caroline sat down beside me. Under the table, quietly, she took my hand. For a moment, sitting in the room I had designed, while the people who had spent years looking past me tried to understand what they had missed, I thought about how often quiet work has to speak for the person who made it. The food was extraordinary, and the company was about to become very quiet. Adrian and his team moved through the room with the particular grace of people who are very good at their jobs. Present when needed, invisible between. The first course was a chilled bisque, finished with a thread of cream and a scattering of chives, elegant without being theatrical. Patricia tasted it and identified the herbs with slightly excessive precision. Tarragon, I think. And perhaps dill? She looked at Natalie for confirmation. Natalie agreed. The conversation moved through the soup course in the Whitmore way, contained, careful, navigating around anything that might require real honesty. Then Patricia opened the broader conversation in the only way she knew how. She folded her hands on the table and said, "Well, this is all very lovely. Ethan, why didn't you mention that you knew Vincent? We could have." She stopped before finishing the sentence. The missing words were obvious. We could have arranged something. She seemed to hear, perhaps for the first time, how that would sound after years of dismissing the very connection she now wished she could use. "We could have used your connection," she finished more carefully. That connection had been available to them all along. They had not known because they had never asked, and because the one time I mentioned my work at Moretti's, Patricia reduced it to a small decorating job. "I did mention it once," I said. "You told me I had done a little decorating there." I did not sharpen my voice or add anything cruel. I simply placed the accurate version of the past on the table between us. A specific quiet settled over the table. Douglas put down his fork and looked at me directly. It was the first time in 3 years that he had looked at me directly, not a passing glance, and not a look through me toward Caroline. He was finally addressing me as the person in front of him. "You designed this room," he said. It was not a question. It was a recalibration spoken aloud. "I did," I answered. 4 years ago. He looked at the room again. The proportions, the joinery where the oak panels met the plaster ceiling, the pendants, whose warm light landed exactly where it did because I had measured those angles with a protractor in an empty building shell on a Tuesday evening. Douglas Whitmore had spent his career reading rooms and documents and people. I watched him do it now, and the result was different. Beatrice set down her spoon. She turned to Patricia. Her voice carried the pointed precision of someone who kept social scores. and had just discovered a major discrepancy. Patricia, you never said your son-in-law was responsible for this room. This room. Deborah tried to book it for her anniversary. The Caldwells tried for their daughter's graduation. Nobody could get it. She looked around at the oak paneling, the ceramics, the light. Patricia produced the composed, gracious, faintly pained smile she kept in reserve. I didn't know either, she said. I looked steadily across the table and answered, You didn't ask. 2 words. No performance, no volume. Just the flat, clean fact of them placed where everyone could see. Patricia said nothing. Douglas said nothing. Caroline's hand found mine under the table. Quiet, a little late, but there. Douglas raised his glass. To 40 years. Crystal met crystal. We drank, and then something shifted. Not with drama or apology or announcement, but the way a room changes when a window opens. The pressure equalized. The architecture of the conversation quietly reassembled itself. No one spoke across me to Caroline. No one performed for Beatrice at my expense. Wesley, the cousin, asked me directly about a restaurant he'd heard was opening downtown. A real question, wanting a real answer. We talked about first-year restaurant economics for several minutes. He was genuinely curious. Beatrice spent 20 minutes asking about my work, the cafe I was designing, how I sourced materials, whether I'd considered the city proper because she had a friend opening something, and she would pass my name along. I answered honestly and at length because someone was asking. Natalie, near the end of the main course, leaned close and said quietly, I had no idea. I'm sorry we didn't know. She meant it. She was not her mother. Patricia ate her dinner. She was quiet for most of it. The kind of quiet that is very loud. The quiet of a person rearranging years of calculation in the face of information they chose not to have. After dinner, the family gathered their coats and moved toward the exit in small clusters. I said goodbye to Adrian at the entrance to the private room corridor. He gave me a handshake, firm, professional. The handshake of someone who understood the evening without needing it explained. I walked the room one last time before leaving. I did not do it purely for sentiment. I wanted to see the room as it was now, used, warm, and lived in. The ceramics had been cleared, the candles had burned down to stubs, and the oak panels caught the last of the ambient light. What had once been a drawing on my table for 10 weeks was now a place where people had eaten dinner and changed their minds about someone. I put on my coat and walked out. In the parking lot, Patricia found a moment alone with me. She always does. The quick word, the arm touch, the gentle private management of something she considers an inconvenience. She had used it to redirect me at dinner tables, to steer me towards stores on Millbrook Avenue, to walk me 10 feet from a restaurant entrance and ask me to wait outside. It was her instrument. I let her play it for 3 years. Now she used it in the parking lot under a cold October sky, with the amber light of Moretti's falling across the blue stone behind us. I hope there are no hard feelings, she said. The voice was gracious, measured. The voice of someone offering an olive branch they expect to be taken, because it is always taken. She expected me to accept it because I had always been sensible enough to accept whatever version of peace she offered. I looked at her for a long moment. She was 63 years old. She had raised a daughter who could not look up from the ground when her husband was told to stand outside in the cold. She had spent 3 years using the word freelance as a category and individual as a polite diminishment. She had done it all with such practiced warmth that half the time I had wondered if I was the one being unreasonable. I was not angry. Anger had burned off somewhere in the last 2 hours, leaving behind something quieter and more permanent. Clarity, again. And beneath it, a kind of tired relief. The relief of someone who has finally stopped waiting for a situation to change on its own. Patricia, I said. She straightened slightly, ready to accept the acknowledgement. You asked me to wait outside a restaurant I designed in front of your family and your friend because of how I was dressed. She opened her mouth. I want you to understand that I know exactly what that was. She closed it. I'm not interested in managing your feelings about it tonight. I paused. But I need you to know that I won't be doing that again. Any version of it. Ever. I did not raise my voice. I did not list the 3 years of accumulated incidents. I did not ask her to apologize. I had learned enough about Patricia Whitmore to know that an apology extracted under pressure was worth nothing. What I needed was not remorse, but the knowledge, lodged somewhere behind her composed expression, that this particular dynamic was over. I walked to Caroline's car, got in, closed the door. In the side mirror, I watched Patricia stand in the parking lot for a beat longer than was comfortable, before Douglas appeared at her elbow and touched her arm, and she turned. They walked to their car together. I looked straight ahead at the restaurant's amber light, the bluestone path, the small topiary I'd recommended 4 years ago when the owner had asked about entry plantings. Low maintenance, I had said, but it'll look like it's been there a long time. I had always liked things that looked like they'd been there a long time. Caroline drove. For the first 5 minutes, neither of us said anything. The heater ran. The highway unrolled ahead of us in the dark. I'm sorry I didn't say anything in the parking lot. Her voice was careful. The voice of someone who has been turning a sentence over for hours. I know. I kept my voice steady. Caroline began. I've always, with her, I know, Caroline, I said after a pause. You have frozen for 3 years. Tonight was the last time. She was quiet. What does that mean? I had been looking out the window. I turned toward her. It means, if something like tonight happens again, any version of it, I'm going to leave. Not the restaurant, the situation. She kept her eyes on the road. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. That's fair, she said. After a long silence, she added, she was wrong. Her voice sounded different then, lower and free of the usual hedging. I should have said that tonight. I should have said it a long time before tonight. Yes, I answered. Another silence followed, but it was not empty. I love you, I said finally. That's why I'm still in this car. She reached across the center console and covered my hand with hers. We drove the rest of the way home without words, but they weren't needed. The important things had been said. The question of what came next, that was up to her. The following Thursday, Beatrice told 2 friends about the dinner at Moretti's. I know this because by Friday afternoon, I had received 2 messages through my studio's contact form from women in Crestwood. One asking about a home office redesign, one about a kitchen renovation. Both mentioned they had heard about my work at Moretti's from a mutual contact. Beatrice, it had turned out, was as effective a networker in my favor as she had been in Patricia's orbit. She could not stop talking about the room. On Saturday, Douglas called Caroline. I heard Caroline's side of the conversation from the kitchen. Brief, awkward, slightly formal. She came in afterward and set her phone on the counter. My dad wants to know if you take on residential projects. I looked up from my coffee. He wants your card, she added. Douglas Whitmore wanted my card. Who had asked Caroline what her husband thought? Who had never once addressed me as a professional? Who had called my work niche? I wrote my studio email on a business card and left it on the counter for Caroline to pass along. On Sunday, Caroline showed me a text from Patricia. Please tell Ethan, the room is beautiful. I should have known more about his work. Not an apology. Not quite. But it was a text, and it was real, and it had cost her something to send. I read it twice. Then I set Caroline's phone down. Are you going to respond? She asked. No, I said. Not yet. I called my mother that evening. Did she apologize? Lillian asked. Not really. Was it enough? I thought about that before answering. I don't need her apology. I need her to stop. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Those are different things, she said, and one of them you can actually get. Later, a text arrived from Vincent. I heard the evening was eventful. The room looked good, didn't it? I replied with a single word. Perfect. 3 weeks after the incident came Caroline's birthday. The Whitmores hosted a Sunday dinner. Smaller, casual, immediate family. I wore what I always wear. A good cardigan, dark trousers, simple earrings. I did not dress for Patricia Whitmore. I did not dress against her. No one commented. Patricia had set the table before we arrived. When I walked in and found my place, I stopped for just a moment. She had seated me beside Caroline, not at the end of the table, not beside an elderly relative from out of town. Beside my wife, at the center of the family's table, where I should have been seated 3 years ago. Patricia did not say anything about it. She would never say anything about it. I did not expect her to acknowledge the correction, because doing so would have required acknowledging what she had been doing before. I understand that. I am not waiting for her to say it. The placement was the thing. Before dinner, I was standing in the kitchen doorway when Douglas passed through. He paused. He looked mildly uncomfortable, the expression of a man doing something that does not come naturally. I saw the piece in Compass Living, he said. They mentioned your work at Moretti's. Good write-up. He moved on before I could respond. I stood in the kitchen doorway and let it settle. Dinner was different. I spoke, and people listened. Natalie asked about my cafe project. Genuinely asked, the way people ask when they want to know the answer. Wesley mentioned he had looked up my portfolio online. Beatrice was not there. Patricia had not invited her. I drove home that night and called my mother. Was it perfect? Lillian asked. No, I said, but it was different. Different is enough to start. Caroline and I sat on the couch that night. No television, no phones, just the house settling around us. Thank you for not leaving, she said. I didn't want to leave, I told her. I just needed it to change. She nodded. She understood the difference. A week later, I was back at my studio on a Tuesday morning, working on the cafe project, laying out the banquet dimensions, thinking about the material palette, making the 100 small decisions that add up to a room. The work was quiet and absorbing, and mine. I paused and looked at the portfolio shelf. The Moretti's folder was there, 4 years old, a little worn at the spine. Inside it, hand-drawn sketches, material swatches in a dozen shades of warm oak and amber, a signed contract, Vincent's handwritten note from the first anniversary. The room is yours anytime you need it. I thought about what he had meant when he said it, and what it had turned out to mean. I designed that room in a year when I wasn't sure of much. I didn't know who would sit in it, what conversations would happen there, what it would come to mean. I just knew how the light should fall and where the warmth should gather, and how a piece of reclaimed oak feels when you run your hand across grain that has lived a long time. I hadn't known it would someday be the room where, in front of everyone who had ever looked past me, something said clearly and publicly, he built this. Not my voice, just the room. I hadn't changed that night at Moretti's. I was wearing what I always wear. I was the same person I had always been. So were they. The difference was that this time something in the walls, the oak I had chosen, the light I had placed, a manager's bow on a bluestone path, spoke louder than their silence ever could. I still shop at thrift stores. I still drive the same 10-year-old hatchback with the coffee stain on the passenger seat. And the next time someone tells me to wait outside a room I helped build, I'll already be holding the key. For years, I had believed that patience meant staying quiet long enough for people to recognize my worth on their own. What I learned instead was that patience without boundaries can become permission. The night outside, Moretti's did not make me more talented, more accomplished, or more deserving of respect. It only made visible what had been true all along. I had built rooms where other people felt welcome, and it was time to stop accepting relationships that required me to stand outside them.